So 2024 is an election year for South Africa, and it certainly is a year when the country will bring in the 7th democratic government. One defining distinction about this particular poll is the implementation of the Amended Electoral Act, which expands electoral participation. Also, multiple polls are predicting a decline below 50%. That's for the ANC's majority. But South Africans have their own bugbears, like getting jobs and blackouts, as they ponder their voting decisions. Well, we have that discussion now to set the tone for the year with SABC News Political Reporter Samkele Maseko. And he's, of course, watching the political landscape and joins us in studio to give us what we hope will be regular forecasts ahead of these very hotly contested polls. So good morning to you, Samkele. Thank you so much for your time.
A very good morning to you and to the viewers.
Yeah, we've talked about the expanding of the electoral and political landscape going into these polls, right? What are some of the bugbears that you have then as a political reporter, considering the list of candidates that we're looking at? I mean, we're hearing that that ballot paper may very well look like a booklet.
Indeed, that ballot paper will look like a booklet because if you're looking at the number of independents that will be permitted to contest these elections, they need about 15,000 signatures to make sure that they are on the ballot paper. Samkele Maseko can just stand up and say, I want to be a public representative, and I go to my village in Appelspoort and say, please sign these signatures in my entire village, neighboring villages, and I'm on the ballot paper. And then I can contest. So you can just imagine how many people would want to enter the political fray. You've seen business people or those who've been in the private sector like Roger Jardine, Songezo Zibi, the former journalist and former spokesperson and communications manager of ABSA. He's also on the aspiring to be on the ballot paper through his political formation. They just launched over the weekend through Rise Mzansi. And you've also got former politicians who've now hit the ground running in their new political homes. Former President Jacob Zuma with his MK party. Many people saying that he wants to send Tutuzane Zuma and his other kids and his other political associates into parliament. You've seen Ace Magashule now clubbing up with MK, even though they're going to be separately on the ballot paper. So that tells you that it's going to be a festival of political parties going to try and get our votes, promising us jobs, this and that. But the truth of the matter is, political parties and government does not create jobs.
Yeah, and I want to and of course we're going to look into some of those big players and the big moves, chess moves that are being made by some of the political figures. But I'm keen to hear your thoughts on whether or not, as we get closer and closer to these elections, you get a sense that South Africans and the electorate is looking at the politicians or the personalities and how big and grand some of these personalities are, or really asking questions around, load shedding and service delivery and what those people are putting in their manifestos.
Interestingly, I listened to Dr. Zwelini Mkhize speaking in Ndwedwe. In KwaZulu-Natal, in one of the regions where the ANC was having their cadres forums. And he said that it is very wrong for leaders to go around besmirching people's names and saying disparaging things against people. When people are faced with triple challenges of poverty, inequality, coupled with corruption. For instance, if you go to Ndwedwe, it's been affected by the floods. Some of the bridges have been swept over and kids can't go to school. You go to areas such as Ladysmith in the province and north of towards Gauteng and in the Tugela district, that also tells you they are also affected by the floods. Ladysmith, Newcastle, those areas. So people are more worried about their bread and butter issues as opposed to personality cult politics. People are not particularly bothered whether Jacob Zuma has opened up MK or Cyril Ramaphosa is facing these issues or Julius Malema is coming to fill up Moses Mabhida. People are worried about their bread and butter issues. For instance, if you go to a township or to a rural area and there's a funeral, many people nowadays, because there's food hunger, they tell their kids to go to those funerals, especially when people are dishing up, and they tell them, take the plates of food through the takeaways that are there, and you bring them home, and they then are secured of a meal for the next 3 or 4 days for their children. With schools reopening, people are very eager to send their kids to school because that is where they will get a hot meal to eat at the end of the day. People are not bothered about political theatrics of who is being suspended, who is being removed from which political party, or whether Jacob Zuma has broken away from the ANC. It is the bread and butter issues, and that directly correlates to the voter turnout in 2021, which was the lowest in history in local government. And that may escalate and go further to these general elections because people are disenfranchised with the current political system and how politicians are going about their issues. For instance, to take John Steenhuisen, he went to KwaZulu-Natal, to eThekwini, to say, rescue the eThekwini municipality. But you look on the other side of Tshwane, refuse is sometimes not collected in the townships. The townships are not properly serviced. You go to some areas, including Johannesburg, including Ekurhuleni. Sometimes water provision is not being provided to the affluent areas where you would assume that service delivery is at its highest level. You go to the amount of potholes that are there, and it cuts across whichever political party is in charge. You go to Khayelitsha, you go to Gugulethu. It's deplorable conditions that people are living under. You go to Umlazi. At some point in 2016, people had to jump over refuse to go and vote in that specific municipality. And that tells you that service delivery across the board
is an issue. And one would hope that going into these elections that you've got candidates that are speaking to the issues that people are facing. Let's talk about one big issue that we certainly have really looked at since the beginning of the year, and that's been South Africa approaching the International Court of Justice. I've heard quite a few pundits and experts saying that, well, the positioning of political parties along their thoughts and their beliefs around the conflict in Gaza and Palestine and Israel is going to be a big one for how people vote as well in these elections. Would you agree with that?
We need to first characterize and look at South African socio-economic landscape and look at the people who may have an interest in international politics and who are affluent with what's happening at the international front first and foremost. Someone who's sitting in Appelsbosch, or someone who's sitting in Ndwet, or someone who's sitting in deep rural Venda, deep rural Eastern Cape, Edutwa, for instance, where they have a leaking roof, where they don't have a TV, where they don't have electricity, they would not be that much abreast. I'm not saying they wouldn't be abreast. They may be, but they would not be thoroughly as informed as someone who's sitting in Houghton, who's sitting in Sandton, who's sitting in Cape Town, whom is largely affected by these issues pertaining to the Palestine and Gaza conflict. So someone who is relatively of middle class will have more of an interest on that particular issue, particularly if you're looking at the turnout of the people who went to protest in support of Palestine in Cape Town and the numbers that are there, particularly the Muslim community. And that gave the governing ANC nationally an entry point to that specific constituency for the very first time in a long time, which the DA has chosen to alienate. Hence, the resignation of Khalib Kachalia from the Democratic Alliance and the alienation of the Muslim community by the Democratic Alliance in this particular instance may benefit other political formations like Al-Jamaa, like Patriotic Alliance, whom will not necessarily benefit that much themselves because they've also chosen to identify themselves with Israel. So you are looking at an Al-Jamaa, an ANC, a Rise Mzansi, relatively benefiting from the DA choosing the side of Israel as opposed to the oppressed people of Palestine, and particularly the stance of the president in this particular issue being vociferous and very clear that South Africa will stick with the oppressed people of Palestine and moving with the non-aligned movements of the world in the similar stance of former President late Nelson Mandela on this particular issue and historical relation of South Africa and Palestine.
Let's talk about a party that certainly in previous elections has been very impactful in really deciding which way the results of an election go, and that being the Economic Freedom Fighters. We see Julius Malema really spending some time in Liberia yesterday for the inauguration of the president in Ghana today. I mean, what do those moves really say, and what do you see for 2024's general elections for the Economic Freedom Fighters?
One thing we cannot take away from Mushabi is that he's a political strategist. In South Africa, I always say there are very few political strategists remaining. You can arguably say it's the incumbent Cyril Ramaphosa, it's Julius Malema and Helen Zille as well. You can't take away that Helen Zille is a political dinosaur. She is very strong. But Mushabi is fastly eating into being the second biggest political formation in the country. When the DA declared EFF as enemy number one in their Congress, the DA's National Congress, it is because research is showing that there may be a 2% or 1.5% difference between the DA and the economic freedom fighters. The EFF is projected to be at about 15-16%. The DA is projected to drop to about 18%, 17.5%.
Yeah.
That is very close. The EFF is already an official opposition in a number of provinces, Mpumalanga, Free State, also in the Northwest Province. So that tells you that they are growing at a rapid speed, and this minimal growth that you may see in these elections, and with a drop that is projected for the Democratic Alliance, it puts the EFF at a vantage point to get closer to being the official opposition, which will then tell you, which is why the ANC and the DA are now in trout of discussions or collaborations in how to regulate coalition governments. Because if they were to put in that threshold of 1%, 2%, looking at the voter turnout of the 2019 general election, that would only leave you with 5 political formations in parliament. It would be the ANC, the DA, the EFF, the IFP, Freedom Front Plus. Those would be the only 5 political formations represented in parliament if you were to take the threshold that they're trying to introduce and the voter turnout of 2019. And that would automatically tell you the DA, which many people hardly ever speak about, is sitting at 55.4%
Interesting.
in the Western Cape. And if they drop to about 18% nationally, they are also projected to drop in the Western Cape. They may not dip under 50% in this election, but should they dip under 50% in this election, who then benefits, who then becomes the kingmaker?
What is behind that loss? And now we can go on for hours. What is behind the loss with the Democratic Alliance that has been so steady as the opposition?
The DA's, the Western Cape has the most hung municipalities in the country.
Yeah.
They've got about 25 municipalities in the Western Cape. 17 or 18 of them are hung. The city of Cape Town, the DA is dropping. In other municipalities in the Western Cape, they are dropping. It is because of the formation of Patriotic Alliance, which is eating into the DA's voter base, and also the gradual growth of other, also the breakaway of Good Party to a certain extent, but also the disenfranchisement of people of going out to the polls. The ANC and the DA are suffering from the same electoral loss fortunes. That is why you may see them trying to club up together, and the DA saying EFF is enemy number 1. And if the Moonshot Pact does not get the 50% threshold, the DA can simply say, we've done everything that we could. We clubbed up with other opposition parties. It didn't work. We're only left with one choice now. And
that's to work with the ANC.
And that's to work with the
ANC. It's a really interesting turn of events. I need to squeeze this in before we go, because I think this is important. The new kids on the block, Rise Mzansi, and of course the MK. What do you foresee there? Throw the bones.
The reality is South Africa is a very polarized political environment. Rise Mzansi is what the DA used to be. It's all inclusive of all races within the country. But unfortunately for them, they are largely concentrated in Gauteng. If you go to Eastern Cape, for instance, where Songezo Zibi is from, you go to Mthatha, those specific areas, you don't see a lot of Rise Mzansi billboards. You don't see him mobilizing, specifically going back to his own constituency. You see him mobilizing here mainly in Gauteng. Look at former President Jacob Zuma, largely mobilizing in Zulu areas. You come to Gauteng, you'll find him in the hostels in Tembisa, you'll find him in the Vaal, you'll find him largely in Zulu concentrated areas. He's largely mobilizing in KwaZulu-Natal. You can see it's got an element of a tribalistic campaign. No, I'm not saying it's tribalistic. It's got an element of that specific tribalism. You've also had their own chairperson in KwaZulu-Natal, Sponi Sotuma, pointing that specific issue out. And then you've got your Patriotic Alliance, largely concentrated in the colored communities. Yet again, I'm going to what? The polarization of tribalism and race in these elections. The DA, the Freedom Front Plus, largely mobilizing in white and Afrikaner communities. Largely the ANC, the EFF in black communities. So you can see it's a tribalistic and a racial campaign that we're going to, less about service delivery, less about jobs, but more about politics of spectacular.
Right, and affinity. And I think there's a bigger conversation to be had about what that says about our, our tagline that we give to the world about South Africa being the place of unity and diversity. But we could go on for hours, and of course, Samkele Maseko always keeping a close eye on things on the political stage, and we'll keep catching up with him as we get closer and closer to those elections. He, of course, is our political reporter.